Welcome to my intro guide to After Effects. Today we're going to be going through the making of this effect and explaining all the concepts along the way. Take a look.
Here, you're going to need this. For what?
Alright, and to make this effect we're going to be going over importing footage and the timeline, masks, keyframes, using pre-keyed footage, layer blend modes, applying effects to stylize footage, compositions and pre-composing, and automatically keyframing using expressions. Alright, so the first thing you're going to need is the video footage that you're actually working with. And even though this part of the process is outside of After Effects, it can sometimes be the most important part of your edit. This is the footage that I'm working with. A key part of this footage that makes this edit possible is that the camera never moves. If it even moved a tiny bit between each part of the action, it's going to be much more difficult to line it all up during the editing process. You can just drag it straight into here, into this project panel right over here. And once you have it in here, you can drag it on this button right here. This will make a new composition and set all of the settings of the composition. You can see composition settings to whatever your footage was shot at and the correct frame rate and everything. And right after doing this, go ahead and save your project. Because if you don't save your project at least once, you can't autosave. And having autosave set up is something I highly recommend. I'm just going to call this beginner tutorial, stick it in my documents. And if you go to your preferences right here, there's an autosave option. So this will save every 20 minutes. It makes sure that if I'm working on this for a while and for some reason After Effects crashes, which it will, I never lose any more than 20 minutes of progress. You could lower that down to 10. Just do whatever you want. It's just really good to have that set up. So now that we made our composition, we can see that we have the footage down here in our timeline. We have the timeline itself. I can scroll through here. I can watch the footage. It'll show me everything that's going on. And if I wanted to, I could zoom really far in using this scroll at the bottom. This is going to let me go all the way down to a frame by frame view of the footage if that's what I want, if I really want to get that precise. But I can zoom back out here and we can see we have about 55 seconds worth of footage here. It's just the entire thing that I was shooting. If we click on this arrow right here, we can see the transform options of the video. These are pretty self-explanatory. Position will change where the video is. Scale is going to zoom in or out. Rotation is going to rotate the video. And opacity is going to fade the video in or out depending on, so you can fade it into if there's any layers behind it or underneath in this case. Anchor point also moves it around, but as you can see, this center point of it stays in the center. So if you move the anchor point and then rotate, as you can see now it's rotating around a different point. So to achieve the effect that we're looking for here, we basically have to layer in two parts of this same footage. So we're going to start by duplicating this just with Control D. All of those options are available under Edit up here as well. Duplicate is right here. And so now if we look at these little eyeballs on the side, this is going to let us switch between which one we have. So let's say I move this top footage to when the second version of me starts to come on in. So we're looking at this one. If I turn off the eyeball, we'll be looking at the bottom one again. Now, since what we're trying to do here is line up the action of these, we want the gunshot to line up with me blocking the bullet. So the gunshot happens right here. We find that location in the timeline. Now if we want to line these up really nice, one easy way we can do this, if I turn back on this top layer and I go into those transform properties here, if I take this opacity and I set it down to 50%, now you can see this footage is half faded over top of the other footage. So now I can see both of them when they're doing things. So this is right about when the gunshot's going to go off, and I can move this around and so that he reacts at around the same time. So he's about to react right here. Okay, we'll have to make that. And now if I can use these controls right here to go frame by frame to see how things look. And yeah, he's reacting at around exactly the same time as the gunshot happens. And if I want, I could go back and watch this action play out between both of these at the same time. So as you can see, boom, he brings up the gun. The other guy is ready to block it, but they're both faded out right now, and so we're going to be fixing that next. Now in order to combine these two clips seamlessly without this fading and stuff going on, I can just turn this guy back up to 100% opacity. We're going to use masks. And to demonstrate how they work, I'm actually just going to create a new solid, which is just a solid color piece of video, and we'll make it black just to showcase how masks work. So this is, yeah, just a piece of black here. Now, a mask can be created using one of these tools up here, either one of these shape tools, or you can use this pen tool to freeform draw a mask. And basically what a mask is we're just cutting out a piece of the footage. So let's make a little square here. As you can see, we've cut out a piece of the black solid right here, and now it just goes right over top of whatever was underneath it. And if we look into that mask, we can see we have some other options in here as well. The first option here is going to be the mode of the mask. Right now it's set to add. Add basically means whatever's inside of the mask is going to show. Subtract will do the opposite. Now whatever is inside of the mask is not going to show, but it'll show all of the rest. If I set it to intersect, this is going to work if we have two different masks. Now, this is an add mask right here, but if I put it above the intersect mask, now it's going to make it so that only the intersection between those two masks shows up. You also have the ability to just hit inverted on these, which will kind of just convert an add to a subtract, but there will be some cases where you want to actually use that inverted. Then we have these other options right here. The mask path one, you can see there's a shape option. So if I drew a pretty garbage rectangle, but I wanted it to be a good rectangle, I could hit reset to rectangle and it's going to make it a perfect rectangle. Again, that's pretty useful. This mask feather option right here, this is going to basically blur out the edges of the mask and blend things together. That's going to be really useful, and we'll get into that later. Mask opacity is going to be how much the mask's effect actually happens. So since this is an add mask, if the opacity of an add mask is at 0, it's not going to add anything. It just won't show the layer at all. This is also pretty useful for different things. Sometimes you want what's inside of a mask to be able to appear or disappear separate from the main layer's opacity setting. And lastly, we have mask expansion. If you raise this, it'll expand the mask and make it so that basically there's this rounded edge around it where more of the layer itself appears. There are a couple more useful things when it comes to masks. So if you just select the layer itself and then you grab one of these points, either with your mouse tool or elsewhere, you can just move around one point of the mask itself, and that'll change the mask's path. You can also use the pen tool, select the mask to add more points to it. You can move those around if, say, you wanted more points in your mask. What I've done right here is I've actually double clicked on the mask, which sets up this little rectangle. This lets me scale the mask, sort of like it was its own layer, and also lets me rotate the entire mask, which is pretty useful as well. Now, if I go into here on the side and I actually select the mask itself instead of just the layer, now when I select a point, it'll move the entire mask. And there's another thing that you want to not get mixed up, and that's whether you're moving the entire layer or just moving a mask. So if I look at the position of this, it's still set to what it was by default. Now, if I select this layer and I move it around, I've actually moved the position. I wasn't moving the mask. But if I instead select the mask and I move the mask around, the position of the layer itself is actually still the same. Now this is really important. Say if I was making a mask between two pieces of footage, let's say I pick a box out of this one. So if I was to move this whole layer around, it's going to look something like this. Oh yeah, it's like I just moved that entire piece of footage around. But if I was just moving the mask around, it's going to look like this. See, now I'm moving just the area that is cut out by the mask, not actually moving the layer underneath it. So that's the difference between that. All right, so to create our cloning effect here, since we have two guys on two different sides of the footage, the easiest way we can approach this is just take our pen tool and split this guy in half. We'll just grab this portion. This is with the top layer selected, which makes us make a mask on that layer. And boom, there we go. All of a sudden we have both guys in there. And honestly, already this looks pretty decent. There isn't an obvious change here in the middle where the mask is, sometimes what you'll see is it'll look like there's actually a line here. And you can you can just barely see it. But if I were to move this mask around, let's take a look-see here. Maybe we would end up with a line. I mean, of course, if I cut my entire self out, you can see there's a big line there. But there will be, sometimes if the lighting is just slightly different between the two takes, you'll see a bit of a line. And we can usually resolve that by adding some feather to that mask. So let's feather this out by 100 pixels. Now if I move it around, you can see when it starts to intersect with something, it fades it out instead of just cutting it. And that's really useful for taking two pieces of footage like this and getting them to line up properly without any sharp edges in your masking. So this works pretty well for this frame, but if we start to scroll back, we're going to see that eventually this is not going to work because, oh, this guy walks into the other footage is over top of him, and he disappears into the void. Not exactly what we're looking for. So this mask is going to have to change over time, over the time of our footage. And when it comes to changing things over time in After Effects, the way that we do this is through keyframes. You're going to be using keyframes all the time. And so here's a quick example of how this works. So as we discussed earlier, there's a mask path here. Now, anytime we want something to change over time, and anything that can change over time is usually going to have this little stopwatch. It says, time varies stopwatch, toggle ability of property to change over time. Wow, that sounds exactly like what we want. So if I click this, all right, a couple things have happened. First of all, this is now blue. Blue means, yep, we have the ability to change this over time. But on the timeline, we can see now right beside where this mask path is, we have a little diamond. And this little diamond is our keyframe. And now I've set this diamond up on a frame where things look good, right? Things look good on this frame. So I want the path of this mask to be exactly right here during this frame. So let's go to a frame where things don't look good. Let's go all the way back to here. Things don't look good in this frame. We need to change how this mask looks. So let's take our select tool, do the thing that we talked about earlier, select the entire mask and just push it over to here. So now, as soon as I changed that, this has made another keyframe. That was just an automatic process. Since I set this thing up with the blue right here, it's going to make keyframes when I change this property. So now if I look at the space between these, we can see the mask is now moving. Because I set one state over here, another state over here, it's going to do all of the work in between those two states. It's going to move the mask path from one to the other. And so that is pretty nice. I don't know if you can really tell, because if you don't see that big purple thing, you can't really tell where the mask is. But actually, if you really look, there is some subtle lighting changes over there, where you can see just in this area as the mask moves. But that is basically going to get us most of the way to our effect just by doing that. It's as simple as that, because this mask is going to move in at the same time this guy is moving in. And look, it passes over the spatula right as it stops moving, which is good because in this piece of footage, the spatula is at rest. It's already on the table. So that's actually a really good timing right there. And as you can see, there's almost no change in this spatula as the mask goes over top of it. And so it looks very seamless. For editing purposes, I'm going to disable the audio on these just so that I can play it without it playing. But yeah, so he passes the spatula, he picks it up, and boom, the action happens. So that was so easy to do. Just because the footage was shot really easily, we just moved the mask of one footage over top of the other footage without cutting off anything that was different between those two pieces of footage. All right, so the next step is going to be the gunshot. So one thing that I always like to use for things like this is pre-keyed footage. And so I've inputted these two. These are two pieces of pre-keyed footage. They're from a pack called Action Essentials. You can find all sorts of pre-keyed footage packs on the internet. And what I mean by pre-keyed, let me just put this into a new composition really quickly, is that it has an element. In this case, this is a muzzle flash, but this file right here has just the muzzle flash and the smoke and no background at all. So if I create like a new solid, let's say I make something that's red and I put it underneath here, you can see the muzzle flash is set up right over top of it, and there's no like black background, there's no background at all, which means you can put this footage over top of anything. And pre-keyed, the reason that we use that term is that, like, say if this was filmed in front of a green screen, you would have to take out the green, and that would be known as keying the footage. It's pre-keyed in this case, so it has that transparent background already built into it. So it is as easy, let me just delete this composition because we don't actually need it. Yep, it is as easy as taking this pre-keyed footage and slapping it right over top of our layer, going to where it exists in the timeline, all the way right here, making it showing where the flash is, and you just drag it to where you want it. Now, if I were to play this, boom. Okay, not exactly winning any awards as far as realism right here. It's basically just a JPEG that appears for a frame, and honestly, the quality of this pack, I think I got this in like 720p many years ago, so it doesn't exactly always fit the best in this context, but this is to get us started. Now we want to take this pre-keyed footage and we want to make it fit our scene better. This kind of brings me back to how important it is how you shoot things, because as you can see, this gun is right over top of a very overexposed background. And that is a bit of a problem because normally when you're adding something that is a light element to a scene, you're going to want to add it using a certain blend mode. And I'm just going to quickly get into blend modes right now. So let me move this over top of here. So right now we have this thing called mode over here, and it's set to normal. If that's not showing up, there's this toggle switches modes. You can see all these switches are the other view. You might have to hit that to get the mode show up. So there are a bunch of these, and playing with these can be a lot of fun in different things. So, but usually for like muzzle flashes, my go-tos are going to be either add or screen. These are going to make it so that the pixels of this pre-keyed footage interact with the pixels behind them a little differently. So right now, they're just replacing the pixels behind them, basically. But if I set it to screen, now you can see that things are a little bit brighter and the color is a little bit closer to what it is in the background. Or like, and if I do add, things are even brighter because what it's trying to do is it's trying to add the brightness of the muzzle flash to the brightness of the background. And this is where what I was talking about earlier comes into play. If you're trying to add something to something that's already really bright, it's just going to be white. Yeah, you just get white there. And so this was not the best context to put a muzzle flash. But as you can see already, this blends into our scene a little bit better, and you can see the smoke a lot better than when it was on normal. When it was on normal, it just looks like a JPEG that appears, and you can kind of see the smoke. But when it's on add, you can see the brightness. I mean, yes, it's super bright, but that's sort of appropriate for this scenario. And the smoke is also pretty bright, which is why a lot of people use screen, because it's just not quite as bright as add, but still blends very well into the background footage, as you can see. And so, but yeah, it's really going to depend on what you have underneath it. See, if it was over top of something dark, you could see it a lot better. But since we're using a mode that sort of combines brightness, you can't see it nearly as well. But out of curiosity, let's see how this looks on some other blend modes. So if I do a darken blend mode, as you can see, you can hardly see this at all because it's trying to look for pixels in the top layer that would darken the layer underneath it. But as soon as I bring it into the light, as you can see, yeah, a lot of our stuff is darker than that overexposed background. Multiply, ones in the same section here will sort of do similar things. Color burn, that's doing its absolute best. Classic color burn. Going through these can be a lot of fun sometimes, especially when you're making some really crazy looking effects. But as you can see, this doesn't exactly help us blend our muzzle flash. Overlay, that's another one that's That's pretty soft. Soft light is also very soft. Hard light is trying its best as well. Vivid light. There are just so many of these. And then there's these like subtract ones. This is where it's going to do like an inverted muzzle flash, and that's kind of interesting. Divide is going to like divide the colors, do some weird stuff. I honestly don't know how a lot of these work, but they're fun to experiment with. So in our case, I think we're going to stick with something like screen, or I might switch it to add just to emphasize it a little bit more. Unfortunately, it is in this overexposed area of the shot, but I'm not too worried about it. We will go from there. So similar to how I added this, I'm going to add this little firecracker as the sort of bullet bouncing off of the spatula. So I've got to scroll all the way to this piece of footage because he is very small. See, I didn't trim down my clips first. It's usually a good idea to take this, which is your work area, and reduce it down to around the area of the footage that you're working in, because later we can trim the entire composition down to the work area, which is very useful to do. So this firecracker, I'm going to make it appear 1 frame after the muzzle flash is like gone. So the muzzle flash lasts for 2 frames. Firecracker is going to go right here. This is a little large, so I'm scaling him down. Yeah, it's just going to be a little guy right here. And we want it where the spatula deflects, so we're going to put it about right there. Pop, it's going to pop, it's going to disappear. Now we're dealing with the same issue where we got to choose which blend mode to do this on. Screen is going to make it pretty bright there. Add is probably going to make it even brighter. Yep, really depends on how you want things to look. But look, we got bang, boom. And see, you know, doesn't look too bad. Unfortunately, yep, it's all in front of this overexposed background. Ooh, shot composition matters. Wow. Editing isn't everything. Hope you're enjoying the guide so far. If you are, leave a like or a comment to let me know. Also, if you find the information in this guide is valuable, you can tip me using my Ko-Fi link in the description. Thank you very much for your support. Alright, so there are still some things that we could do to stylize this muzzle flash a little bit more, and it might not look the best in this case, but we do have a glow effect. Unfortunately, I don't know how well you'll be able to see it if there's all this overexposed background, but let's solo this. Okay, so with this, we are only seeing the layer of the muzzle flash, and if I toggle this glow effect, so this is before, this is after, this is really glowing it a lot. So there's some settings we can change here. I always like to bump up my radius of a glow quite a bit, like 100, even maybe 200. That puts it a lot higher, so now we can see the before and after of that. It's a lot brighter and sort of wider glow around it. Now the threshold, if we raise that, that's going to make it so that it doesn't overexpose the center of it too much and retains a bit more of the color. So I'm going to set that all the way up somewhere high. 85 is pretty decent, and I could even bump this radius up to 300 if I wanted to. And so if you look at the before and after now, we have, yes, that, and then boom, that really brightens things up. Now, how well does that translate to putting it over this overexposed background? Well, it doesn't translate that well, but it does glow it a little bit more. Let's see if we can do the same with the spark. So take a look at this spark. We have it right here. If I add a glow onto that, yep, that's really going to up the purple on there, which is kind of fun. Set that to 300, same threshold of 85. Yeah, you know, look at the before and after of that. Really pops it out a little bit, and you look at that, oh man, that is a bright glow. And you can kind of get away with things like this if they're only happening for a couple frames, you know? It's not like that spark is there for very long, and it sort of just adds that little extra pop. Now the glow will be applied to other things in these pieces of footage, so technically we did apply a bit of a glow to the smoke, which brightens it up a little bit too. Might not be something you want, in which case you could do something like this, where you go to the frame that you still want the glow on. You go to this one, you hit split layer. That's going to split it up a little bit. So now if I switch the timing of that, we now have the glow, And then we can take this piece of footage, delete the glow from it. So then we have the glow footage and just the normal smoke, which, yeah, sure, let's keep it like that for now. So let's take a look at what we've got now. We've got boom, boom, bink, the shot and the deflect. It's not perfect, but it certainly is something. So this would be actually pretty decently passable as it is, but one thing over time that you want to consider is how can I use a little bit of creativity to maybe add some bonus realism to something like this. So like if a gun was fired around this area and a flash of light happened here, where would this flash of light reflect off of? And can we make that happen in 3D space? Technically, this gun is a little bit in front of this wall behind us here. So you'd think some of the muzzle flash would reflect on the area around the wall, but it wouldn't reflect on my arm right here. So can we make that little bit of light happen for that period? Let's experiment with that. So one way that we could approach something like this is make a new solid. We can start off with that. Let's make it some kind of bright yellowish muzzle flash related color. So I like to make it something like this. And so, I mean, we have this. If I set this to an add mode, you can see it really adds to the area around it. If I set it to a screen mode, you can see it. This is what the screen looks like if it's just a solid, but add mode, you know, it's decent. But let's just set this back to normal for now, but let's turn off the visibility of it and start to carve out where this light should exist. So guess what we're going to use for that? We're going to use masks. So I'm going to go to this ellipse tool and start to create sort of a circle. I'm going to create a circle around where the light would be coming out from. And if I hold control here, this is going to create something centered around where I started drawing it. So we'll create this circle right here. Now if we turn it back on, we have this. Not exactly what we're looking for, but we know that the circle is going to reflect on this wall, but not the wall behind it. So let's see if we can add another mask. This time it's going to be a rectangle, and we're going to line up this edge of this rectangle with the wall. So let me grab my tool here, make sure I'm selecting the footage, and just line this up with the corner of this wall. So if we have two masks, if I turn this back on, right now they're both set to add. So let's set the second one to intersect. Now we just have this in the area that's on the wall. It's centered around where the gunshot would be coming from. Of course, this doesn't look good yet, but that's the next step. So let's get the arm out of the way, because we know that this light shouldn't be reflecting on the front of my arm. So if I turn this layer off again and I just trace out the area that I don't want that light to be reflecting on, which is going to be around here-ish, doesn't have to be perfect, around this area of the arm, and I'll go a little extra far here just in case, because we're probably going to be doing a lot of feathering. Trace around the arm, trace around the arm. Also, while you're creating these points, if you drag, you can create curves. If you want curved masks, I usually will just make a mask with a lot of different points. So they're sometimes a little jagged, but when I'm feathering them, it won't matter if they're too jagged in most cases. So yep, all right. If we have this third mask and I go down here and I set this to subtract, now let's turn it on. Okay, now we have this. We have a little piece of yellow, my arm roughly carved out, very jagged, and all of this. So let's start stylizing this to make it not look terrible. So first things that we can do, start to feather out some of our masks. So let's look at this intersection mask, and I just hit F and it brings up feathering. Let's add 100 to that one. Okay, so that actually feathered out this area to the side here, which isn't exactly what I would be looking for. I would want to feather out the first mask. Let's put 100 on there, and yep, now we've got that feathering on this side of things. And I probably want a bit of feathering on the one that's masking out my arm here. Let's put 20 pixels on that. And as you can see, that really blurred out the edge of my arm there. If I select off of it, now it looks like this. This looks a little funny, if you ask me. Don't know if that's exactly what we would want this to look like, but we're going to be stylizing it still. So let's start by, if I go to this timeline and I use Alt and the square bracket keys, I can easily cut this so that it's only up to 1 frame. And I can use the square end bracket to make it so that it's also only on that 1 frame. But technically this muzzle flash lasts for 2 frames. So let's extend that out to 2. So we got boom, boom. And my hand does move a little bit in there. That might be something to consider. But there we go. So now if we look at this, it looks like that. And we just have this goofy bit of yellow here and it doesn't look good at all. That's okay. Let's start to make it look good. So I feathered it up to 300 and now we have another problem. This extra mask that we made at the beginning, it's starting to hit the edges of it. And so you can see there's a little bit of a square going on here. So a couple ways we can solve that. We can expand this one a little bit, either by changing its path or by changing its math expansion. But we wouldn't want to change the mask expansion, sorry, because then it would expand it past here and we're not looking for that. So instead we will just drag these out a little bit. Cool, very good. And if we want to make things look good, we're always talking about blend mode. So let's set that to add. And oh, okay. Now it very much looks like a reflected piece. Like something very bright is reflecting on that wall. I don't think it should be that bright. I don't think this wall is made out of mirror necessarily. So that's a bit much. Now, one of the ways we can mitigate that is we could turn down the opacity of this layer itself so that it's just a little bit more subtle. Now we have something like this. But it's still, honestly, it's still too obvious. Trying to do too much. It's it wouldn't actually reflect that much. So what if we really lowered it down to only like 10%? Just a very subtle flash on the wall. Okay, that doesn't look too bad. That's maybe a little bit more reasonable as to how it would look if the gun was shot from there. Now we could experiment with something similar to this guy because he's having this huge spark happen right in front of his face. So this could be kind of interesting. Let's also create a new solid for this guy around the same color as this purplish explosion. We're going to want to put it on top of things as well, and we'll turn off the visibility of that. In this case, let's just make a mask that would roughly cover the area in front of him, but not too much of the side of him. That would have light reflected onto it. And it can be quite rough. It does not have to be perfect. So we're going to get a bit of the chest, a bit of the front of his arm here. We're not going to get too much of this arm, only the top part of it and sort of the front part of this, so that it's just this sort of slightly forward facing portion of him. So now that we have that traced out, if we turn this back on, hooray, we have this. And so, well, let's do the add blend mode. Okay, that's adding quite a bit. Let's boost up the feathering a little bit. If I feather this by 50 pixels, we can see, okay, yep, also adding quite a bit. If I was to set this to screen, nah, I think it still looks better ad-wise. But once again, if we really turn down the opacity and make this just a little bit more subtle and make it only happen for the frame that things are happening. We got this frame, we got this next frame, and then it's gone, so we'll put it away. So that only lasts 2 frames. Now, what does that look like in the grand picture of things? Now you can see there's just a little bit of brightness going on, just for that time. And so without it, it's just there's a light in front of him, but it's not reflecting on him at all. But with it, it's like, oh, there's a light happening in front of him, and it's actually affecting him. And so sometimes subtleties like that can really just slightly improve how your stuff looks. Let's look at it before. All right, we have the gunshot and we have the reflection. It's not bad, honestly. Doesn't look too bad. But add both of these back on there and there's just a little bit more of a subtle effect going on here. We have the wall changes a bit. He changes a bit in the brightness in front of him. And so it's like the stuff that we added just fits into the scene just a little better. Okay, so let's adjust the work area to just when things are happening here. So yeah, this is the start of the work area right here. We go all the way through, the action happens, and right before we break character, I'm going to set the end of the work area here. And that is just going to help us restrict what we are concerned with. And so if I then go to composition and I trim the composition to my work area, now it's all trimmed, so we're only dealing with this. That is quite nice for us. So one thing that you might notice about this scene is that it's a little bit flat because, well, we couldn't move the camera at all. And one thing that we can do is add a little bit of camera movement back into this. Now we can't actually move the camera, so it's not going to have any parallax like an actual camera movement would have, but it can still help to sort of ground a scene like this, and especially one with action. We can actually fake it as if the cameraman themselves are reacting to what's going on in the shot. So to do this, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to pre-compose all of these. Now, we're in a composition right now. If we go up here, we can see we have this composition. And compositions can exist in other compositions. So if I drag all of these and I hit pre-compose, we have this option. It's going to move all the attributes into this new composition. So I have this, it's called pre-comp1, and now it's like it's just one video file that has everything in it. And if I double click it, you can see, look, there, it's all still there, and you can still edit it in here. But whatever we edit in here is now going to be applied to just this one video track. Now this is nice when you want to be able to make changes to everything here without making those changes happen to a bunch of different layers. It can just really reduce the work you have to do. And since we're trying to move the camera, we would want to be moving all of the layers at the same time. So that's pre-composition. Now the way that we're going to make this happen is, well, first of all, you could go to the position, you could keyframe it, and then you could move a little bit forward. You could grab this, you could move the camera a bit, and then you could do it again, and then you could do it again, and then you could do it again, and then you could do it again. And you sort of, after a while, have a bit of camera movement in there, but that doesn't look great. And it's really annoying. Let's try to do this automatically. So let's reset our position to normal. Now, first of all, we don't want any black showing on the edges. So if we are going to be moving this around, let's start by scaling it up a little bit. It's another reason why it's usually decent to give yourself a little extra room in your shot in case you want to be able to do something like this afterwards. Now let's go to the position, and if I hold Alt and click this, it says when I hover over, it says Alt click to add or remove expression. Now this is pretty cool. I alt click this and it gives me this text box here, transform.position. And so what I can write in this text box is basically a function that is going to apply to this position over time. And so there are some built-in functions in here that we can apply. And if I start typing one, let's see, we have wiggle. Now I like wiggle. Wiggle is basically going to say, all right, change the values of this by a certain amount at a certain rate. And so if you're familiar with coding, this is basically like calling a function. So wiggle has two parameters as far as I know. The first one is going to be how much we want to wiggle by, and I believe the second one is how quickly we want to wiggle. So let's start with just a wiggle of 10 and set 1 to how often. And let's see what happens here. Oh, you can barely see it, but there's a tiny bit of wiggling going on. Clearly 10 was not enough for the amount. But as you can see, look at these values. As I move, they're changing automatically, and I didn't have to set any keyframes to make that happen. Let's boost that all the way up to 100 and see how much it wiggles. Now, if we look around, wiggle 100. Oh, I see what happened. I got the parameters mixed up. Actually, the first one is going to be off, and the second one is going to be the amount. So let's do wiggle 100. There we go. Now we're seeing much more wiggle, and I believe 1 is the amount of times per second it should wiggle. So now if we just watch this footage, you can see, okay, well, the camera is moving. We have a bit of a camera motion in there. It's not terrible. Now, we're going to reduce how much that wiggles a little bit, but I also mentioned that we could potentially make it so that the cameraman reacts to what's going on in the scene. So the cameraman is usually wiggling around the place just a little bit, you know. The camera's moving just a little bit. That's not too bad. But how do we get him to react? Well, we have an effect on here that I think is very useful for working with expressions. It's called the slider control. And it is a control. It's specifically under expression controls because that's usually what it's meant for. So sliding the slider isn't going to do anything, but that's a number. And there's numbers that go into here. So if we can get this number into here, we can then use keyframes on this to control how much is going into here. So let's try that. So what I want to happen is the cameraman to be a little bit shocked that a gunshot just rang out in the middle of this place. So if I go to the point of the shot, boom. So right now we have this expression set to wiggle 175. 1 being, I believe, 1 time per second, and about 75 pixels in this range right here. So let's set our slider to 75. And then in this expression, we're going to delete the 75 and we're going to take this little lasso, the pick whip as they call it, and we're going to pick the slider control. What that does is it puts in effect slider control slider. So it says take this number up here and put it in as the second number in this expression. Now it's literally working exactly the same because we have it set to 75. But if I set this to 500, now we can see, oh, yep, now we're really going. Now it's at 500. Oh, the camera's going everywhere. But that means that we now have keyframe abilities. So 75 is the cameraman's default level of panic. He's not too panicked about it, but let's say he starts to panic a little bit when the shot happens. Let's keyframe this slider control. And if we hit U on this, when we have this selected, it's going to open up specifically things we have keyframed. So that's really helpful if we want to be able to see that keyframe in our timeline. So I set that keyframe. We're going to put that a couple frames earlier, and then right now we're going to set this to double. So we'll set it to 150. So that way, within the time of this, the cameraman's going to get a little bit more shaken up. He's going to start moving the camera a little bit more, but then over time I want him to settle back down to 75. So I'm going to change the value back down to 75 here. Now what do we get from that? Well, we have a bit of camera movement. And then, oh, he jerks the camera just a little bit when the gunshot happens. Now, he's a little early because I put these so that the camera moves before the gunshot even happens. So let's move that so that he actually reacts after the gunshot happens. So, oh, okay. Oh, and so that's still a little bit too much of a jerk for me. So I'm going to make this just a little more subtle. Okay, yeah, see, now he just goes, whoa. It's just a little bit of a whoa. It's like not like too crazy, but I could always raise this value to 200. And that way it's like, oh, okay. Oh, see how the cameraman reacts to that now? Now that's a little bit different. See, that's kind of cool. And one final thing that we can add, whenever you're moving around a clip in After Effects itself, you can actually add a simulated motion blur to that. So if I toggle my switches and modes and I enable this one right here, this is the motion blur one. I allow that, and then that'll also turn this on. You have to make sure this one's on. Now you can see on the frames when things are moving, there'll actually be a little bit of motion blur applied to what is moving in the background here. Don't know if you'll really be able to see it, but because it's pretty subtle. If things were moving around very fast, then you could see it a lot. Like if I put this value up to like 800, then what we would see is a lot more motion blur. If I enable this, yeah, see, look at that. Now it's really motion blurred up when the things are moving around. Now I don't actually want that. I think 200 was just fine. And so that'll just add a little bit of what you would have if the camera was actually moving. So let's take a look at what we have at the end of the day. Well, there are bits of this that I like, but bits I would also want to change. Now, even though we have an expression on this position, if we look at things, we have a decent bit of space still that we could work with. And I gave a bit too much headroom in this shot, honestly, because the legs are a bit cut off and there's a bit too much room above them. So let's scale up the shot just a little bit more to 115. And then even though there's an expression on here, we can actually change the position that the expression is acting on. So let's lower that down a little bit in the shot. Now we have to be careful because we have to make sure the wiggle never cuts off anything on the top. Wait a second, I put things in the wrong direction. I don't want them to go in that direction. I want them to go downwards a little bit. There we go. So now I've given them a little bit less headroom and zoom things in just a little bit more. I could also give it a little bit less extra room over here because there's more room over here than there is here. So I could do a little subtle shift in that direction and just reframe things a little bit. Always an advantage if you have some extra space. And since I shot this in 4K, I would probably render it out in 1080p, which means I wouldn't have quality reduction from zooming in and changing how some of this footage is. Boom. All right. And you know, I'd say that's pretty good for a beginner. So with the basic concepts that I showed in this video, honestly, you can accomplish a lot of what I have uploaded on my channel. My last video on video effects called Your Worst Enemy uses this cloning effect all the way through it. It's mostly just using masks. You can see the making of video to see some of the other stuff I put into that video. And when it comes to making more advanced effects, really it comes to just familiarizing yourself with what other effects are available to you within the software itself. There are all of these that I didn't cover that all do different things. And then there are plenty of plugins you can also get for After Effects that are going to really increase your capabilities. But with these basics, there is so much that you can do. And so really just be creative, come up with a cool concept, shoot a video, and just cook. Just cook in the editor. Have a lot of fun with it. And I hope this gets you started on making something sick in After Effects.